Everybody, we're going to go ahead, and it's 5:30. Beth, you okay with getting started?
Sure.
Okay, well, again, I want to welcome everyone tonight. We have a real special treat with our guest speaker tonight. I want to briefly, first of all, I'm Mike Bivens, president of the Medical Alumni Association, and I truly have the honor of introducing our special guest. Dr. Lyle was born and raised in Huntsville, Alabama. He attended college and medical school and served an internship at the University of Alabama and the University of Alabama School of Medicine. After completing his residency in internal medicine at the University of Texas at Houston and a fellowship in cardiology at the Texas Heart Institute, he made his way to Orange County, California. After always wanting to pursue writing, he took some writing courses, joined a few groups, and just started. 20 years later, he has written over 20 books in fiction and nonfiction, and now is an Amazon #1 bestseller. Not only is he a writer, but he actively hosts a blog, podcast, and does consultations for writers. We are so happy to have him here with us tonight. Please all welcome Dr. Doug Lyle as our speaker tonight, and Beth Eddings will be acting as our moderator for tonight and leading the conversation. Beth?
Thanks, Dr. Bivens, and welcome everybody just on behalf of the Medical Alumni Association too. I'm excited to be here and kind of be leading this conversation. We had some really great questions submitted by everybody that registered to attend, so I'm going to start with those. And I put a little note in the chat. Feel free to include your questions there, and we'll kind of work through them as this hour to hour and 15 minutes goes, and we're just going to have a good time and kind of let it go from there. So Dr. Lyle, now you're in the hot seat. So let's start out with a little bit about your background, and because there's some people here that will know it and kind of went to school with you, but there's other that may not. So if you could provide us with a brief background of your experiences, what led you to medicine, and then maybe how you got to California.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dr. Bivens, for your kind words. And I'm glad to be here. I always say I don't get invited very many places, and never more than once. But that's another issue Bucky knows all too well. But actually, I actually came to medicine at a very early age. When I was about 10 years old, I remember my dad and I were watching a documentary on TV. This would have been the mid-50s, and it was about the first blue baby surgery, which we now know is the Blalock-Taussig procedure. And we watched that, and I was fascinated. And I told my dad, I said, that's what I want to do. And he said, well, that'd be a good thing to do, and let it go with that. My parents never really pushed any of us in one direction or another, but they gave us free rein to go where we wanted to go. And I never wavered from that. I mean, I knew before I went to medical school that cardiology was where I was going. There was no doubt in my mind. I mean, that's the direction I was going. In fact, I moved to Birmingham the summer between college and medical school and did research over there in the VA research wing with Eddie Edelman and Tinsley Harrison. Actually, we wrote a couple of papers. And then, then medical school and internship there. And I remember the old Hillman well. I still have images of the old anatomy lab up there that was right out of Edgar Allan Poe. It was so gothic and dark, and those dirty windows and the light was, it was spooky. And then after that, I remember in my internship, I was going to stay in Birmingham and do my residency and some research and all that, which I'd been doing for the 5 years I was there. But Joe Reeves called me in his office. When you get called in Dr. Reeves' office, you're like, uh-oh, what'd I do now? I always said if he ever made a movie of Paul Bunyan, he would get the starring role. But he was one of the nicest people on earth. And he said, my good friend Walt Kirkendall is starting a new residency program at the University of Texas at Houston, and he's looking for good people to go there. Would you be interested? And I said, I don't know, would I? And he said, well, it's a great medical center, and Walt's a great guy. So I flew there and met him, and especially a guy named Herb Fred, who was just phenomenal. And so I ended up going to Houston then for my residency. And then halfway through my first year of residency, I did a straight medicine internship. So that counted as first year residency back then. So I'm in my really second year residency. And Walt comes to me and he says, they got a slot starting in 3 months over at Texas Heart. Do you want to go over there? And I said, well, what about boards? He said, I just write a letter. You can sit for the boards even with 2 years. I said, really? Well, get me out of internal medicine, send me to cardiology. So I went over to Texas Heart, and then after that, I left and came out to California. Um, Great experience. I still say Birmingham's the best medical center I ever went to, but Texas Heart was pretty cool. It was run and gun.
That's awesome. So, and then we'll kind of move into talking about your writing.
Yeah.
So when did you kind of start, and what was that impetus to get you started?
Well, I get asked that question a lot, and the answer is that I always wanted to. And I tell people that if you grow up in the South, you have to be able to tell a story or they won't feed you. They'll just put you out behind the barn and let you wither away because you're not really worth anything if you can't spin a yarn. And I think that's true. And my whole family was that way, and everybody I knew was that way. You can always tell a story. And I did a lot of distance running back then, marathons and all that. So I would think of these stories that I wanted to tell and all that. And about 25 years ago, I said, when I retire, I'll write these stories. Well, I'm not retired yet, but I said, mostly, but not completely. And I said, but if not now, when? And so I took a couple of night classes at UC Irvine and then joined writers groups and just started writing. And, I found out that writing a story is a whole lot harder than telling a story, but everything just took off from there.
Why forensics and crime?
Well, this audience will definitely understand this. If you are a physician and you go to a cocktail party, everybody wants to talk about their cholesterol, their prostate, and their gallbladder. And they'll come up and ask you questions about it. It's just the nature of being a physician. But if you go to writers' conferences and they find out you're a physician, they want to know about poisons and death and gunshot wounds and stab wounds and all this stuff. And then they want to know about forensic science, thinking you should know something about it. So I said, well, I started answering questions for them, and I started getting emails and stuff from writers who want to know how to create a scene, how to tell this, how to do that, how does this work? So I kind of self-educated myself in forensic science, but when you think about it, it's really the same thing. I mean, all forensics means is in the eyes of the law. So it's looking at science from a legal aspect rather than from a medical aspect, but the science is the same. Anatomy, physiology, toxicology, all of physiology, even physics and chemistry, they're all the things that you already know. It's just looking at it a little differently. So I found learning the science of forensic science to be simple and intuitive because, well, we were all trained in it, and it's the same thing, really. It's just a little different.
So how do you balance practicing and writing?
I'm lucky. I never needed more than about 5 hours of sleep. Sleep just never was important to me. In fact, I still find it intrusive. If I never had to sleep, I'd be happier. Though I sleep a little more now than I did back then. So 5 hours was plenty for me. So I go to bed at midnight and I'm up at 5. I've been doing that all my life, really. I drove my parents crazy as a kid because I'd be out terrorizing the neighborhood before they got up. And I think it gives you plenty of time. You got plenty of time to do it. Now, back when I was practicing full time and where you're running around emergency rooms in the middle of the night and all that stuff all the time, it was a little more difficult time management. But since I kind of step back and only do office work a couple of days a week, I got all the time to write I need. I mean, more than I need. You do that. Both of them are important. Both of them are important parts of my life. I enjoy both.
So do you do a lot of research to inform your writing, or is it based on knowledge that you already had?
Mostly the latter, because again, as I tell writing students all the time, if you're going to write about a medical thriller or something that's very heavy in forensic science and all that, just remember that the story is not about the science. It's about the people, and the science obviously impacts the story, the plotting and the telling and the solving of the crime and all that stuff, but it's really about the people. I think Michael Connelly has famously said many times that it's not the effect of the cop on the crime, it's the effect of the crime on the cop. And if anybody's read Harry Bosch, you know how true that is, because Harry Bosch is always affected by the crimes that he's investigating. So at the end of the day, storytelling is about people. And you take a person and you put them in a stressful situation, and they got to figure out a way out of it. In addition, writing a novel is a lot like taking care of a sick patient in a VA intensive care unit. You got 5 organ systems that are trying to fail on you, and you got to keep all the balls in the air. And writing's the same way. You got to get plot and character and point of view and dialogue and all that. And if you fail on one of those, the story dies, just like the patient dies in the ICU. So there's a lot of analogies there. Yes, there's a lot of balls to keep in the air, but it's fun. It's problem solving.
What does your writing routine look like? Is there a certain way that you do things with each book, or does it change?
No, I don't really have one. I refuse to. I've had a day job all my life, and I refuse to let writing become a job. It's for fun. It's been a lot of fun, and I've spent countless thousands of hours doing it, but I do it because I want to. So I know a lot of writers. My good friend T. Jefferson Parker, Jeff has a time. He gets up in the morning, he has these hours, and he's going to write. And a lot of writers do that. I refuse to do that. I write when I want to, and I don't write when I don't want to. And I find that more relaxing as it is. I refuse to do deadlines. I've had a couple in my life, the Royal Pains books and Forensics for Dummies. They had a deadline. But now I tell my publishers, when it's done, I'll send it to you. But fortunately, it's done pretty early, so they're happy about that. But still, I just don't like having that, because practicing medicine has too many deadlines, too many time constraints, too many inroads on your life, and all the physicians out there, nurses out there know that it really controls your life for many, many, many decades. And you can't get away from that. It comes with the territory, but I refuse to let writing be that.
So how do you make your recurring characters continue to be likable? This question had compared it to John Sanford characters. So how do you keep them?
John's a great writer, and he's a very, very pleasant gentleman. His characters are phenomenal. I mean, some more than others, but he's got a couple of characters that are just iconic, and he's published so many books. I think that if you're going to spend time with this person, and particularly if it's a recurring character, it's not just a one-off, a standalone, as they say, and you're going to write a series, you better like them, because you're going to live with them, and you're going to live with them for a long, long, long time. And so you just create characters that you would want to hang around with, even if they're not like you, even if they're not necessarily nice people, but you've got to create someone that at least you have some kind of empathetic connection with, that you care about them and care about what's going to happen to them. If you don't, I mean, what's the point, number one? And number two, it will show in the writing. You've got to really like your characters. And if you do, the reader will.
That's a great point that I haven't ever thought about before. So that's really interesting. When it comes to physicians that are also authors, other physicians that are writing, is there a forum or groups that you're a part of? And this person had asked and said that they have self-published 3 books, but we're curious about how to do traditional publishing.
Yeah, well, 2 parts to that. Number one, I think that being a physician or any scientist actually interferes with writing until you learn to worm your way around it. The reason is that we are trained to be linear thinkers. We're trained, even though we look at a lot of possibilities, at the end of the day, it's A equals B equals C equals D, and voila, you've got the solution. And you know how to march through a disease process or some constellation of symptoms, and you know how to eliminate what's important and what's good, but you're really going in a linear fashion. And everything has to be factual. Everything has to be based on test results and your physical exam and your conversations with the patient and all that stuff. You have to take all that stuff and you have to create some logic out of it. That's just the practice of medicine, and we all know that. But fiction writing is messy. It's not like real life. It's different. It's a view of real life, but it's not real life. And so you have to get the all that exactness and all that over explaining and all, look how much I know. I'm so cool. I know all this stuff. You got to get that out of there because people don't care about that. Again, it comes back to characters. They care about people and the effect of the science on the people. As far as getting publishing, the publishing world now versus 25 years ago when I was first trying to get published is night and day because there are so many outlets that you can self-publish. And there's a lot of great self-published books out there. But the problem with self-publishing is that you don't have an editor unless you pay someone and they charge you a lot. And you cannot edit your own work. I mean, even after 20 books, my agent is a great editor. My agent, we've been together 20 plus years. And then the publisher always assigns another editor. And they will find things that you'll say, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. It always happens. So that said, yes, you can still self-publish, but the traditional path is not easy, and it's a whole lot harder now. You have to first find an agent. Well, what do you have to do? First, you got to write a good story, and then you got to get it in front of them on a day that they're in a good mood and are interested in that. And then they will look at it, and then they will say, okay, this is interesting, and then they go shop it around. Well, now you got to find an editor at a publishing house that says, on a good day, and they're interested in that, and they say, oh, well, we can look at this. And then say they take it on and they say, oh, we're going to publish your book and you're going to be a superstar. And then the marketing people come in and say, yeah, but we don't know how to market this. And then they say, bye. So there's a million steps along the way. But I've been fortunate. Everything I've ever written now, my 22nd book's coming out in October, and I'm just today are working on the final rewrite of the 23rd, and 4 short stories, and everything I've ever written has been published. But I work at it, and I had my first book. It took 2.5 years to write. It was a piece of garbage. It was terrible,
Continual improvement as you go, right?
Oh, you do with everything,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how was it, and this will kind of transition us into TV as a topic. So how was it that you went from just being an author to then kind of taking on that new role of consulting with television? What's that part of the story?
Yeah. Again, if you go to writers' conference and people start asking you all these questions, and then I started answering questions, and I ended up publishing 3 question and answer books of all these questions that novelists and screenwriters sent me. And I have on my computer over the 25 years, 6,000 questions that I've answered for writers and screenwriters. And I put about 170 of the best in 3 different books. And they're good reads because the people ask questions and you get an insight into the mind of a writer, and then you learn a little forensic science or police procedure or storytelling along the way. So I just kind of by osmosis became the guy that people would ask questions of. And I think it's because, first of all, I understood the science, and second of all, I was a writer also. And so you understand what people need. They don't need a didactic lecture, on blood flow. What they need to know is the dead bodies bleed. No, they don't, but they don't know that, and things like that. So I think that's kind of how it evolved. And over the years, I still get emails almost daily from people asking me questions.
So what were some of your favorite experiences with working with television?
Well, first of all, I've been on a couple of sets with the shoots. I will never do that again because, shoot me, boring. They spend 3 hours getting 45 seconds of screen time, and I'm sorry, don't waste my time. But I work with screenwriters, and I work with those. And they're very clever. Screenwriters are very clever people, and they have a very compact story to tell. I mean, an hour TV show has 42 minutes of screen time. You've got to get everything told in that. And you don't have the luxury of narrative. So you can't explain things. They got to happen. They got to unfold in real time. And so screenwriting is very difficult. Anybody can write a screenplay is easy. Writing a good screenplay is horribly difficult. I've written a couple. They're hard. It kind of evolved into that. Several different screenwriters started from CSI Miami and Monk and House and all that. They would come to me and ask me questions, and we would go back and forth, and I would help them plot the story. But I only worked with the writers because, to me, story is everything. And that's how it evolved. And still today, like I said, I get calls and emails from screenwriters all the time that are working on their next blockbuster, so to speak, not knowing that it's not going to be a blockbuster, but it might be might make it to Netflix, hopefully.
If there are other physicians out there that are interested in doing something similar, do you have suggestions on how to start?
It's very difficult. I mean, you have to know people. There's no way to just blindly send out stuff and expect them to. Again, it's a personal relationship, and again, through writers' conferences and through my books and through things like that, I know a lot of screenwriters, but I know them personally, and that's really. And then they'll refer me to somebody else and things like that. But it's not easy. There's no website you can go to and do that. Yeah, it's networking again, like so many things in life.
Yes, sir. So these are going to be some kind of fun ones, and then we'll open the floor up to everybody and kind of just have a big conversation. Is there a crime or medical mystery book that you wish that you had written?
Oh yeah, that's a no-brainer. The Da Vinci Code. I'd be living on a yacht in the Mediterranean right now. Not that it's a great book, but it's a great story. Yeah, that would be one. The Godfather. I think that's one of the greatest books I ever read. The Eye of the Needle. The things that I read way back in the day. There's a lot of great books out there, but I think number one would have to be the Da Vinci Code because it blew up the dynamic.
So have you ever written a scene or a character into a scene that you couldn't solve or get them out of?
There's always a back door. There's always a way out. And if you plot things properly, and back in the day, I used to outline everything. I used to outline every book that I did, the first half dozen or so novels, and to make sure that I stayed on track. And then I started just, that's a waste of time and it's boring. And by the time you've outlined it, you're bored with the story. So I just sit down, chapter 1, scene 1, start writing and see where it goes. But after doing this for a quarter of a century and after writing all these novels, it kind of comes organically and you just kind of know. But do you find things you say, well, that's not working, let's put that aside and let's move in this direction? Sure, that happens from time to time, but less so with each book. But yeah, I mean, you can write yourself in a corner. I mean, I know people that have done it. I get emails from people saying, help me, I'm in this box, what do I do? And I said, well, back up 5 scenes and look where you were then. See, now let's go in this direction, or let's do this. Oh, that makes more sense. Yeah, well, it does. That's why it works. But if it doesn't, yeah.
I think Dr. Wood has a question for you.
Most of us have difficulty even completing a long email without distraction, a lot of ideas, and when you change your topic, then you get distracted and start researching something.
Yeah.
So your intellectual curiosity and imagination, do you ever find yourself challenged with a plot because you begin to evolve a different idea halfway through?
Yes, I mean that's what happens, and especially the way I write now. When I started the Jake Longley series, which is one of my favorite because it's comedic thrillers, and Jake's a funny guy. He's an ex-professional baseball player, and he's a doofus, and he's not interested in doing anything except drinking in his bar and chasing bikinis. He has no ambition, and I love the guy. I've known people like that, but I love the guy. The first book, Deep Six, I had one scene in mind. That's it. I didn't really know who Jake was. I didn't know if he's going to have a love interest or not. I didn't even know who was going to die. I didn't know who the bad guys were. I didn't know where the story was going to end. I didn't even know where the story was going. But I had this scene, and I said, rather than fret over this, let's just sit down and write this scene and see what happens. And I wrote this scene, and then the next scene, and the next scene, and the next thing, and the next thing you know, I'm a third the way through the book, and now I know where it's going. And that's the way I write now. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you do get convoluted. You talked about research, and we talk about it, research paralysis. Some people get in and start researching things like crazy, and then they get lost in the weeds, and then they end up somewhere else, and they end up spending a month doing research, and they haven't written a word of the story. And that can kill a story. Do too much research. People always ask, what's the difference between writing nonfiction and fiction? I said, well, they're exactly the same, only different. With nonfiction, you do all the research and put everything together and organize it, and then try to add a few writing skills to make it more readable and more palatable. But what you're really doing is you're creating a textbook, if you will. But with fiction, I just start writing, and then if I need to research something, I'll do it on the fly while I'm doing it. If I don't need to know it for the story, I don't need to know it right now. But if I need to know it for the story, I know where to find it. I mean, I know people to call or Google and all that stuff. It's amazing what you can find out there. So it's exactly the same, only different. So yeah, you do research, and then you start getting into things you say, well, I never thought of that. But I think the main key for a writer is to read. You must read voraciously. You must read across genres. You must read a lot, because that's where you learn how to story tell. When I was, after my first 2 years, actually all the way through college, and after my first 2 years of medical school, which were a different animal, I always took the month of August off. I don't know why I decided on August. I guess it's because football season hadn't started yet. You know, and I would take the 5 or 6 bestsellers that I was interested in for that year. I would put all the journals aside, you know, the New England Journal and ACI Jack and all that stuff disappeared. And I read those 4 or 5 novels during August every year, all the way through. And so I always kept my finger into reading because I enjoyed it so much. And of course, now I read all the time. And if I'm not writing, I'm reading something. So you have to read to be a writer. You can't just come out of the box and start telling stories, because you're probably doing something somebody's already done, and you don't really understand story yet.
Does anybody else have a question? You can just unmute yourself and ask away. We got a quiet group.
Yeah.
Hey, Doug, Herb Gannon, good to see
Hey,
you.
Herb.
I know you got to have a creative mind, but one of my questions with writing or writing songs or books or whatever, how do you, I mean, after 20 books that you've written, how do you come up with another storyline? Is it just circling in your head, or how do you stay fresh?
Oh, that's a great question. And again, all writers get asked that a lot. Where do your stories come from? And literally come from everywhere. You remember Seinfeld, the great series, was all about where does a comedian get his material? That's really the basis of the series. But ideas are a dime a dozen. But can an idea have the legs to be a 300-page book? Well, that's different. That's a different question, and you don't always know. I think the single most important thing that writers need to learn, and when I teach writing, and I've run a couple of schools over the years, the single thing that writers need to learn is it's not about learning how to write dialogue and point of view and plot and exposition. It's not about all of that. Those are the tools of the trade. But that's like having a scalpel and a stethoscope, not really knowing what to do with it. Is the single most important thing is voice. And when agents and editors say, I'm looking for something new, I'm looking for something fresh, I'm looking for something that speaks to me, what they're saying is the voice. Now, remember, every story's been told. There's only 2 stories. Somebody comes, somebody goes. And that's it. Something comes into the person's life, whether if it's a shark or a droid or whatever, and knocks it off balance, and the story's about them getting it back to balance, or they go somewhere and get involved in something stranger in a strange land. It's the only 2 stories there are, generally. Every story's been told, but it hasn't been told by you. And so get out of the way. Don't worry about the nuts and bolts. Write the story the way it's supposed to be written, the way you want to tell it, and then you can go back and fix it. Hemingway famously said, write drunk, edit sober. And that's what he was saying. Get that editor, that thing that tells you got to structure this properly, out of your head and just spin your yarn. You can always go back and fix it. Writing is rewriting. So that's the single thing. Get out of the way and let your mind go where it wants to go. And don't worry about looking stupid, because you're going to look stupid. My very dear writer friend, Taylor Smith, always said, give yourself permission to write green dreck. You know, Sue Grafton always said her greatest fear was to die and someone would find one of her first drafts, you know, because it's not good, but the story is out there, and that's the key. Tell the story and then fix it and make it publishable. Took a long time to learn that.
Thank you, Dr. Wood and Dr. Gannon, for popping in with those questions. Does anybody else have anything?
This is Stephen Hayden.
Hey, Stephen.
You know, it's really very refreshing to hear somebody who is a physician, who went through all the years of training, who practiced under the requirement of a standard of care that is rigorously enforced for decades, morning, noon, and night, 6 and 7 days a week. To see them find a creative outlet where they can be creative. You know, most of us, when we went into medicine, did not realize how confined we would be, how much we would have to follow strict standards. And we didn't appreciate how much these standards would really be affected, not by our choices, but by the choices of industry, by the CDC or the government or whoever. They're not determined by us. You have talked about the freedom to express your ideas the way you see fit, based on your experiences. Now, to me, that suggests that part of you wanted to have that freedom all the time. And yet all of us as physicians who were licensed, we knew that if we got outside the standard of care, we did so at our own risk. I have done some things in my career that were outside the standard of care. I did them for patients that I cared far more than the standard for. I am not alone. But we as physicians did do things that were exceptional, putting ourselves at risk, our careers at risk, when we thought that was in the best interest of patients. And I wanted to ask you, have you ever seen or heard a book of stories about physicians who, for the sake of their patients, went beyond the standard of care?
Oh, sure. I mean, my late great friend, Michael Palmer, all of his stories were that way. There was somebody that stepped outside the box. You know, Michael, we lost Michael a few years ago. And I remember sitting in a bar with him literally 2 months before he died. And we were talking about storytelling. We were in a bar in New York, and he was a true gentleman, and he was a great writer, and he was a wonderful, wonderful person. But Michael's stories are like that. Robin Cook wrote that way. Tess Gerritsen wrote that way. A lot of physician writers have created characters that had to move outside. You ask if I've always been that way. Yeah, I have. I'm my whole life, I've always had close friends. And Bucky and I talked earlier about a fraternity brother ours, Mike Courtwright, who's a dear friend of mine, that are outside of medicine, because I find medicine very restricting. You know, you have to deal with doctors all day long, and doctors aren't very fun for the most part because of all these restrictions. But you're absolutely correct. Also, we have a standard, and once you put on that white coat, and once you start dealing with sick folks and their families and their friends, you have a restriction. You have restriction in your life. There's all your life. There's things you can't do. There's places you can't go. There's just these restrictions because you have, well, a license to protect, number one, and a reputation to protect, but you also have a moral integrity. And you also have that. But now, on the other hand, are you asking me, you know, do you step outside the bounds? Remember, they like to talk about evidence-based medicine, and my feeling was always, to hell with that. Let's talk about common sense-based medicine. If I didn't learn anything from Tinsley Harrison, it was common sense. Anybody who had any interaction with Dr. Harrison will tell you that that man was kind, smart, and was one of the clearest thinkers I've ever known in my life. He was a brilliant man. And he told me something one night. If you probably remember Harrison, you'd find him wandering around the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning sometimes. I always wondered what he was up to, but he just couldn't stay away from medicine. And I remember I was senior student, and I was, it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and they were setting up a peritoneal dialysis on this woman who had lupus, renal failure, and psychosis. And I mean, they were setting up a peritoneal dialysis up there. So I went down to the cafeteria to get a cup of coffee. And who walks in but Dr. Harrison? Well, we knew each other well because we did research together really for 5 years. We worked on computer programs and all that stuff. Some of the things I did on Saturdays when I wasn't on call or wasn't on duty, I'd go into the medical center and meet with Eddie Edelman and Wally Frohmeyer and Tinsley Harrison. We worked on all these computer logic programs. And so Tinsley said, "What you up to?" And I said, "Well, I got to do a peritoneal dialysis." So we sat down there and talked for 15 minutes while we're waiting to set it up. And he asked me, he said, "I understand you want to stay around and do teaching and research and all that stuff." And I said, "Yeah, that's kind of the plan." He said, "Well, you may decide you want to go out in private practice. You just never know how the world's going to turn." And I said, "That's right." And he said, "Well, I got 2 words for you. And if you need to know what they mean, you'll know what they mean." And he said, "Sit down." And the brilliance of that was overwhelming. And to this day, I remember it. I used it every day in my practice. When you walk into the hospital room or you go into the office to see a patient, sit down. Don't stand by the bedside and look down at the patient ever. Get on their level, act like you've got all the time in the world, and act like you're really not more important than they are. And that's what Dr. Harrison was saying. And God, I can't even imagine not knowing that guy. The benefits of having known that man have rippled through my whole life. Greatest physician I ever knew, by far. Sit down.
You, Dr. Lyle. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hayden. Does anybody else want to pop on with us?
Yeah, thanks to that Tinsley Harrison story. We all have, those of us who were fortunate enough to be around him have stories to tell. That was absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
A question I have, when you're starting one of your nonfiction works, do you already have a conclusion in mind and you work from point A to point B, or do you just start and see where it goes?
Yeah, now I start and see where it goes. But in the end, most writing instructors will tell you have to know where the story ends. No, you really don't. You just have to know the good guys are going to win, the bad guys are going to lose, somebody's going to die because they needed killing. But other than that, how you get from point A to point B is up to you. And like I said, in a lot of the books that I'm writing now, when I start them, the last 10 or so, I don't know what the final scene is going to look like. I don't know. I sometimes don't even know who the bad guys are yet, but they come around, they manage to visit, and you just keep rolling, and you roll on down the road, and somehow it will unfold. It will unfold. Again, if you've read enough, you know how it's going to work. You just have a rhythm and a feeling for storytelling, and you have to have that to write. Simple as that. It's not as hard as it sounds, but then it's a lot harder than it sounds.
Thanks, Dr. Fulmer.
I have a partner, Bob, and Bob says, "Well, I should write a novel." I said, "You should." He said, No, I got a great story. I should write a novel." I said, "You should." He said, No, it would be great." "You should, Bob. Why don't you sit down and write it? Spend 1,000 hours and see if you still feel the same way about it." It's like everything else. If people talk about, that doctors, they make money, they drive Mercedes and stuff, but what they don't tell you is that Mercedes is parked outside the ER at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you haven't seen your family and friends for a week, and you're exhausted. They don't hear that part of it. And so if you don't enjoy the process of practicing medicine, all that other stuff doesn't mean anything. Same way with writing. If you don't enjoy the process of sitting down at a computer, I sound like Nick Saban, don't I? But if you don't enjoy sitting down at a computer and spinning out these yarns, you better go do something else, because the product is not going to work. If you think that you want to be this, you want to be a New York Times bestseller, well, that's a lofty goal, but that's not going to happen unless you enjoy the process. You have to enjoy being in the emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning. But the advantage is, I mean, what other job can you have that you can get up in the morning and you don't have to shave or get dressed, and you can get a cup of coffee and sit down in front of your computer and kill people till noon? I mean, who doesn't enjoy that?
So can you share with us a little bit about, I know you have a blog and you also have a podcast. So talk a little bit about those.
Well, the blog has been around the longest, and it had it's for crime writers basically, but it's all about my books and stuff. So it's a little more personal. I have a podcast called Criminal Mischief: The Art and Science of Crime Fiction, and what I do is, Jan Burke and I did a radio show for 3.5 years called Crime and Science Radio. We did 70 something shows. They're all on my website. You can go listen to them. But what that was is we would invite members of the community, of the forensic science community. I mean, we had FBI agents, we had profilers, we had Cyril Weck, the great pathologist. We had Marshall Clark on there. The list goes on and on and on. But we had the experts in the field, and we would interview them about forensic science. And obviously it was geared toward crime writers, but it was all about, these are the experts. These are the people that know this stuff, and we're going to ask them some questions, and guess what? They're going to teach you some stuff. But then trying to set up Jan and I and them and get us all on the same, it was like herding cats. It was hard because everybody's busy and got a life. So this new podcast, I decided, well, you're going to have to put up with me. I'm not going to interview people. I'm just going to talk about stuff. And so the art and science, I talk about forensic science, and then I also talk about storytelling and the things you need to do to tell a good story and how you write a good story, and then the science behind it. So I like that because they're different outlets. And podcasts are great. I listen to them all the time. I got them in the car on my iPhone, and I listen to them wherever I'm going. Usually the crime ones,
I'm a sucker for a good true crime podcast. Those are great.
Yeah, they're great.
NPR Serial hooked me. And then from there on, it was just, which one do I listen to next? Does anybody else have any other questions? We've got about 15 minutes left.
Dr. Lyle, hey, Tim Howard, Huntsville's home for me as well, and I practice in Huntsville. So nice to hear from a fellow Huntsvilleite. Were you Huntsville High?
Yes.
Oh, nice.
The Panthers, baby.
There you go. I was your across the street rival. I was the Grissom Tigers.
Yeah. Y'all came along later.
That's exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I'm older.
But I just want to say kudos to the advice that Tinsley Harrison gave you.
Yes.
Because we were taught to fear Dr. Harrison and Dr. Champ Lyons because we had his disciple, Ellis Sparks, that put the fear of God in all of us. I did my clinical years in Huntsville. And but I had a pediatric orthopedic surgeon in residency. I did my residency in Columbia, South Carolina, family practice. And I asked him exactly what you're saying. I said, how can you see 35 patients a session and they think you're their best friend? Right. And he said two things. He said, I hug on them a lot, but I sit with them and I look them in the eye. Yep. He said exactly what Tinsley Harrison told you. So kudos. And that just makes me so happy because that's what it is. That's why we want to serve. So I'm tickled about your wonderful hobby, but just your heart of serving people. So thank you.
Well, thanks for that. Dr. Harrison was special. Champ Lyons, you should fear, but I should have feared. He was a tough guy. But Tinsley was one of the nicest. I call him that because that's what he told me to call him. He's one of the nicest, kindest people that I ever knew. He was so smart that he was intimidating, and he was so thoughtful, and he never could not solve the problem. I remember those Wednesday grand rounds things up in the top floor of the VA hospital. They always tried to trick him, and they never could trick him because he wrote the book. I mean, give me a break. But I had a special relationship with him. Like I said, the summer before I started medical school, we started doing research on aortic carotid pulse waves then, and ballistic cardiograms and vector. Remember all those things that went by the wayside. But one of the things we did, one of the most fascinating things with Eddie Edelman and Wally Frohmeyer and Tinsley, and sometimes Joe Reeves would come in. And I said, I spent a lot of Saturdays when I wasn't on call at the research wing, and we'd sit down and we started. It was a pilot program that we did with Harvard, and it was critical pathways, really, is what you're talking about now, but it was computer logic therapeutic and diagnostic programs. And so we, like I wrote the one on treating diabetic ketoacidosis, how you calculate the dose by the blood sugar and the ketones and all that. And I wrote the one on gentamicin dose and renal failure. I did those two by myself. But what we worked on, and I remember this vividly, anemia and jaundice. My God, we would be in that conference room next door to Eddie Edelman's office, and we would have this white butcher paper rolled out. And I mean, it looked like a Los Angeles street map, but jaundice, wow. How many, if that, then this, and if this, then that, and the branching logic that you had to go through to work up jaundice. And Harrison's ability to see that whole picture and to make sure we did it. And we'd come back and change it all the time because, well, this doesn't quite work. And we worked on that for months and months. And we finally started putting them out. And I remember they had the community hospitals around Alabama. They had these old Hazeltine 2000 things where you dial up and put the thing in and you could connect to a PDP-11, which was as big as a refrigerator and has less computing power than my iPhone by far. And they would connect to that, and then they could take the patient, they could put in that, answer 5 or 6 questions, and we could calculate, we could tell them the steps they needed to go through. That's what it was all about. But to spend that time with him over those 5 years I was there was unbelievable. Unbelievable. I can't go on enough about Tinsley Harrison. I can't. And later on, when I went to Texas Art, I found Denton Cooley the same way. He wasn't a critical thinker, but he had the best hands in the league, the best surgeon I ever knew. Denton could do things that no one else on earth could do and do it fast. And yet he was never in a hurry. Everything was in slow motion when he operated. People came from all over the world to watch him operate because he was different than the rest of us. And Tinsley was different than the rest of us. He was better.
So, Dr. Lyle, we did have a question come through in the chat, and it says, was there anything you learned from being a writer or the writing process, such as a different perspective on things or life in general, that you think the physician in you could have used or benefited from?
Other than understanding how to communicate with people, I went back my hometown Huntsville. There's a very high achieving small school there called Madison Academy, and one of my cousins, her daughter taught there, and they asked me to come there and give a lecture. And so I gave a lecture on forensic science for their science class and all that. And it was great. I mean, these students are so bright. I mean, just amazingly bright. So then she said, we're having a little convention. Would you hang around and talk to the students? And I said, what do you want me to talk about? I said, anything you want to talk about. I think they'd like to hear from me. I said, sure. So we got in the auditorium and all the students in the school showed up. And so what I told them was basically this, 2 things. Number one, what do you think you want to do? What do you think you want to do? I said, how many of you out here know what you want to do with life? What you want to be? And just about everybody raised their hand because, again, they're very high achieving. And I said, are you sure? Are you sure that's what you want to do? I said, what you need to do is go find someone who does that for a living and ask them if you can hang around with them for a while. I said, you'll be amazed, especially from this school. They'll bend over backwards to do that. See what they really do and decide, is this how you want to spend your life? Because you're making a huge commitment. Okay, fine. So now you've decided that this is what you want to do. Well, figure out your pathway. Don't lose sight of the prize. Start at the end and work your way backwards. I want this, so I need to do this. And if I have to do this, what do I have to do to get there, et cetera, et cetera. Deconstruct and then reconstruct. And I said, but the best advice I can give you, and I didn't have this advice, and I wish I had at a very early age. I said, take every creative writing, every speech class, and every acting class, if they're available, that you can. Because at the end of the day, it does not matter what your profession is. You have to sell yourself. If people don't believe you and they don't trust you, what's it worth? And that, I think, is true in medicine more than anywhere else, because you're getting people at the worst time of their life, under the greatest stress of their lives, and they need to know that you can be trusted and that you care about them. And if you don't, you lose them. They won't do what you say. They won't follow up. They won't do anything because you haven't sold yourself to that person. And I think writing is that way. Remember, writing is a very lonely profession. You sit by yourself and spin these yarns. You have no idea if they're working or not because there's no feedback. So you have to trust that process. There's a lot of similarities there, but you're selling yourself at the end of the day. Whatever you do, whether it's selling cars or doing open heart surgery, you're selling yourself, and you have to be able to do that. People have to trust you.
I think those are great points. Do you have a favorite accomplishment that has come out of your writing? Like, is there something that you may not have thought would have been your favorite experience from it, but turned out to be something that you really prize?
Oh, sure. And I've always said that of all the hats I've worn in my life, teaching is the one I enjoy the most, because when that aha moment and those little light bulbs come on, that's worth its weight in gold. And so back when we formed International Thriller Writers 15 or 16 years ago, there was not a thriller writers organization. So a group of us got together and formed it. And David Morrell and Gail Lenz were the real founders. David Morrell wrote First Blood, so he's Rambo's father. And he's a great guy, lives in New Mexico, and he's a tough guy. But when we were getting ready to have our first conference, which they had in Scottsdale in July, which I never figured out what, obviously they didn't ask me, but I said, do you want to make this conference different than every other writing conference? You want to make it better? And they said, sure. Why? I said, have a school. I said, what do you mean? I said, have a school. Have a track where people can, a published writer who's a good teacher and a good writer can stand up in front of a class and teach the art of writing. That will make it different than every other writers conference, because every other writers conference has a bunch of panels and they have a bunch of, you know, people drinking in the bar, but make a school out of it. Well, that evolved and it became a day-and-a-half school. And, you know, and the people we brought in to teach there are just unbelievable. John Sanford, you mentioned, taught there, Lee Child, Ken Follett, Jim Patterson. We've had all kinds of people come there and teach in the school. And to me, that's the most rewarding thing, is to see then these students go on and become published authors. And you think, you know, well, maybe I helped a little bit. Yeah, teaching is, you know, I always said knowledge is great, but sharing it's what it's all about. It's not worth anything if it just sits there in your brain.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So Dr. Island and Dr. Bradley, if Dr. Island, if you want to go first, and Dr. Bradley, you can go after. They both got a question.
Okay.
Yes, Doug. Everyone who ever had the privilege of working with Dr. Harrison has at least one wonderful story about him. Have you ever considered making him a central figure in one of your stories, or have you done that already?
That would be blasphemous. No, I haven't. I haven't, and I don't. I've had a physician as a main character in the story, but I kind of shy away from that because they said Michael Palmer and Des Harrison, Robin Go, you know, they kind of carved out that, and I don't want to do that. I find it tedious sometimes, and again, it's too wound up in that world. I think that's what people expect you to do, but I don't really enjoy that. So I haven't done that, and I probably wouldn't do that. But I've read a great book about his life, which is just phenomenal. It's I mean, I had a plaque on my wall in my office for many years. I've got it here now at home, but his great book that I talked about, The Principles in Management of Ischemic Heart Disease, he closes it with 22 cases, and one of them was his own heart attack. And when he was in the ambulance going from the Montgomery area back up to Birmingham, he did exercises to see how it affected the pain. He smoked a cigarette to see how it affected the pain. That's Dr. Harrison. I mean, he was always a scientist. He was always inquisitive about stuff. But he closes that book with something that helped me through my cardiology career for sure. He said, if you will allow me to paraphrase a biblical parable, and it says, and now abideth pain, breathlessness, and fear, but the greatest of these is fear. And fear kills. We know that now. We weren't so sure then. And I remember one of the things he talked about in medical school is when someone's coming in with an MI and they're having terrible chest pain, don't use Demerol, use morphine. He said Demerol will cure the pain, but it will not alleviate the fear. Wow. Wow. And he's absolutely correct. Fear kills. And so just one of the, I mean, we all have, any of us who had any interaction with him have a million things that we learned from him, a million little things. And just his attitude, probably the best of which, and is echoes today, is that if after doing a physical and history a history and a physical examination, you don't know what's wrong with the patient, you'll never find out. He said that so many times. And the second is, if you listen to the patient, they'll tell you what's wrong. And in his hands, that was absolutely true. Well, that art of medicine does not exist anymore. I can tell you that right now. I mean, those of you that are still practicing know that. The referrals I get right now from primary care are mismanaged, poorly managed, and they don't have a clue what's going on. You get referrals for one thing, and there's really three more, much more important things going on that they have completely missed. And the reason is they're training people to go home at 5 o'clock. And I've always said their job is a data input technician. It's not a physician anymore. There's no bedside medicine anymore. They order tests, and they look at the test and then make a decision. And I mean, if you remember those things that Harrison did on the Wednesdays at noon, he would not allow you to bring lab results in there and test and stuff. No, 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 no. History and physical, that's it. And if you didn't know what was wrong after that, you weren't going to find out what was wrong. Now, that's probably much more true then than it is now, because we have so many sophisticated testing modalities. But bedside medicine is a dying art. They don't listen to people. They don't. It's another thing Tinsley said, whenever you see the patient, always make contact, always touch the patient. Again, it goes back to trust. You know, if you don't lay hands on, you're not going to heal. And you're not going to alleviate that fear that's going to kill them. Yeah, it goes on, and I could talk about Tinsley Harrison for the rest of the day. You know?
Dr. Bradley.
Here I am. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, actually, yeah, I practiced under my maiden name Ferguson, and I graduated in 75, but I was the last class to sit under Dr. Harrison's tutelage for Introduction to Clinical Medicine.
Yep.
And you just said one thing stuck with me forever, besides touching the patient, making contact, is he, and I carried this with me, I went into hematology oncology, but he said, if you know how to talk to the patient and know how to really listen to their story, they'll tell you what's wrong with them.
Always.
Always. And that served me quite good stead. Of course, you know, there was some backup that we had to do for hem-onc, but he was right. He was just an amazing clinician. Well,
in our practice, obviously, we have, you know, electronic medical record stuff, and we have computer medicine, all that, which I think is the death of medicine. I knew it when it started, because it puts something else between the doctor and the patient. And we have computers in every exam room. Never, ever, ever have I accessed the computer in front of a patient.
Mm-hmm.
I sit there and scratch notes on paper. I look at them, I talk to them, I touch them, I examine them, because they don't care about watching me work the computer.
Right.
They don't care about that. And I get patients all the time that tell me, well, you know, you're actually talking to me, you're not working on the computer. I say, well, I'm not here to treat the computer. you know, and I think that goes all the way back to Dr. Harrison.
Yeah.
Listen to the patient and they'll tell you what's wrong, and it's true. You got to know how to listen, and you got to know what questions to ask. And that man was a genius at that. A genius at that. He could always ask that one question that changed the whole scenario. He just had a knack for it. Again, he wrote the book.
Right.
For many years, every 2 or 3 years, I would go back and read the first 300 pages of Harrison, because that the cardinal signs of disease, that's really what bedside medicine's all about. And that's a dead art. And it I don't know. I'm just glad I'm closer to the end than the beginning. That's all I can say.
So we probably have time for 1 to 2
Somebody had a question.
final questions. And
yeah.
Hi, Dr. Lyle. My name's Faiz. I'm a first-year medical student at UAB. First off, I want to say it's incredible to hear the story you talk about Dr. Harrison. When I first came to UAB, I actually started doing work in the building named after him. So that's really cool to see. You did mention talking about how medicine has changed now and how it's more computer-based. The bedside manner has sort of gone away. Are there any, you did talk about it a little bit earlier, but are there any tips you would give to a first-year medicine for how to at least somewhat try to maintain that bedside manner, at least do the best we can nowadays with new students?
Yeah, sit down. That's number one. You know, this has been controversial, and they talked about that residents and interns are overworked and underloved and all that stuff. And God knows we were. You know, the nights you weren't on call, you were in the hospital at 11 o'clock at night, and the nights you were on call, you didn't go to sleep. So, you know, it was tough. It was a physical grind, a physical and mental grind. And I know it's a lot less than that now. And they talked about, well, you know, tired residents make more mistakes. Well, the data actually shows that that's not true. That if you're not present, you make more mistakes. I've always said that there's 3 reasons that the old system is better. Number one, if you're going to join the club, you got to pay your dues. That's the least important. But you got to be willing, because they got to weed out the people who don't have the interest, the stamina, the ability to think clearly. You got to weed out those people before they get an MD degree. Fortunately, that doesn't happen very often. Secondly, it's the continuity of the disease. I mean, the worst thing that could happen to you as a junior, senior, student, intern, whatever, is at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, get a patient to come in with diabetic ketoacidosis. Because you didn't turn it over to somebody else at 6 o'clock at night. You were there until that patient was stable. And if it was 2 o'clock in the morning, you were there. Leaving wasn't an option. So you saw the disease from it beginning, from the presentation until the patient was stabilized. And if that took 3 hours or 12 hours, it didn't matter. Well, now you understand how diseases work. If you turn over the patient to someone at 6 o'clock, they didn't see the beginning and you didn't see the end. And so you missed that learning opportunity. Thirdly, and I think maybe the most important, the guys that have been out in private practice know, that you learn to think and act and problem solve when your brain is fuzzy and you're exhausted. And I don't know how many times at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're in the emergency room with a complex patient. You spent the last 2 hours stabilizing, getting ready, and you've written your orders, and you sit down and you go back over your orders 2 or 3 times to make certain that you've done everything right, because you know you're tired and you're not thinking as clearly as you do after your first cup of coffee in the morning. And so learning that ability to say, yeah, I know I'm tired. I'd love to go home and crawl on the bed, but let me take another 20 minutes here. Let me make sure that I haven't missed the boat on something here. And I think all 3 of those things are important. And the old way of training doctors, you know, took care of that for you, because you didn't leave the hospital, you know, you were married to it. I mean, you know, that's the thing about this profession. You're married to it for life, you know, and even when you retire, I guess you look back on it. You look back on all those things, and the things you did right and the things you did wrong and the things you wish you could have done better and the things that you are pretty proud of. And that's true of anything in life. And I think medicine's one of them. You know, I congratulate you on getting this far down the road. And I think, again, sit down, listen to the patient, take that extra time to get to know them a little bit. I remember my father always said he liked a certain doctor there in Huntsville. I said, why do you like him so much? He said, because he always talks about other things. He knew my dad liked hunting and fishing. So he'd always take a couple of minutes and ask Dad about his hunting and his fishing and all that. And that stuck with me. And to this day, every time I see a patient, even if I see them all the time, I always say, you been doing anything fun or been anywhere fun, anything going on? And they always, oh, we went up to here and we did that, and the wife and the kids, and we did all that. And we had a great time. And I'll put a little note in the chart. So when they come back in the next time, I say, well, have you been back to Portland? You had so much fun there. That little thing makes all the, again, trust. So use that. Get to know them personally, not just as a scientific experiment, I guess you would say. And then never trust the computer and never trust a test. A test should only confirm what you already know.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Lyle.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. So we are about 5 minutes over time, but I see that Dr. Lockridge has a question, so he'll be our last
Stanley.
question, and then we'll kind of close out. Hold on, you're muted, I think.
You're muted, Stanley.
I should be unmuted now.
You are now, yes.
Okay, great. I appreciate doing this, Doug. You've taught us a lot about writing and about everything, and it brings back a lot of memories. One of the memories about Tinsley Harrison is that I probably couldn't sit in his rounds today because I have a beard, because he does not teach hippies.
Exactly.
Remember that?
Exactly.
Tell me, what is the favorite book you've written? That's my main question for you.
Oh, well, before I answer that, I got to tell you, Stanley and I met because we drove over from Tuscaloosa to Birmingham together our first day to go for interviews. I think we went over there before medical school, and
that's right.
Yeah, we didn't know each other in Alabama, and then suddenly we were together and drove over to Birmingham.
We were in anatomy. We were in an anatomy lab together.
Oh, of course we were. Anatomy lab, where the first 2 days you're terrified, and the third day you're eating a sandwich with one hand and dissecting a body with the other. It's amazing how quickly you adapt. It's amazing. But asking about your favorite books, kind of like your favorite child. It's kind of difficult. The first published novel, of course, was Lunatic Fringe, is what it was originally called, but it changed and all that. I really like the 2 series that I'm writing now. I like all those books. The Jake Longley series, which I said is more comedic. It's funny, it's slapstick, it's kind of that kind of stuff, but still has a down and dirty crime. And the 5th book, and that's coming out. And then my Kane Harper series, which is darker and more traditional thriller. But and I go backwards and forth. I write one of each series a year, so every 6 months I finish a novel. And I like the juxtaposition going back, because it's 2 different styles, it's 2 different voices, 2 different ways of doing it. Keeps me fresh.
Great, I appreciate it.
If you want to read one to start with, read Deep Six, because it's the first Jake Longley book, and it's a fast read and it's fun. You'll laugh.
I'll do it. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, well, this kind of wraps us up. I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially Dr. Lyle. I know I've personally learned so much, for me to use and to think about, but to also kind of hear personal stories of Dr. Harrison is always really neat. He's such a special person around campus. I do want to ask that the class of 1972, if you're members of that class, kind of hang out with us for a little bit. Everyone else, this will close this program, but for the class of 1972, we're going to talk a little bit about your upcoming reunion next year. So just hang out with us for a little bit.
Thank you, Dr. Lyle.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Send me an email and stay in touch.
Thank you.